So now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, who is Amareswar Galla, who is the Professor of Inclusive Cultural Leadership and the Director of the Center of Inclusive Cultural Leadership at Anand National University in Ahmedabad in India. And his presentation is entitled Discursive Crossings in Liminal Spaces. And having seen the abstract, I'm looking forward very much to hearing what you want to say about this, and also to the panelists this afternoon. I think we should also consider how we might want to respond to some of these points in our discussion as well. So please come up to the stage, Alan.
Cheers. Thank you, Janet. And thank you to all the young people who are sitting at the back. And I realize several of you are students, which is good news for people of my generation. When I was communicating with Evelyn, I had no idea that she's not even half my age. She was so respectful, so mature, so kind in the way she communicated. And then you see, Kia, Tamara, but they're all the same age as my daughters, much younger than me. And I think that the future of safeguarding intangible heritage is actually in better hands than it was in my generation. So would you join me in congratulating all the young people sitting at the back? It's a huge responsibility. I do take responsibility for some of the things that we didn't do right in my generation, but we will try to be there for you if you think you need us. And I decided, because the email that came to me inviting me to give the keynote speech came as a surprise. Ever since I moved back to India 5 years ago, I kind of felt the world has forgotten me. And out of the blue. And then when I looked at the people who signed at the bottom, of that letter, the old comrades, when we were trying to convince people about the importance of intangible heritage. Thank you for remembering, I really appreciate it. And so what I thought is that the question was, what I've been asked to address is, how have museums changed in the last 2 decades, if you will, in addressing intangible heritage. So I thought, given that I was there, at the coalface as a foot soldier dealing with these issues globally, not only in Australia but elsewhere, I thought I'll make this presentation autoethnographic, which I see is a very popular methodology that is being used by both museums and art museums, at least in the Nordic world. Autoethnography, I thought it's a useful methodology for me to approach. I was born, brought up, and educated in India. I did finish my PhD from Australian National University. That was quite an accident in some ways, but most of my research was done in India. I was privileged to work in Australia for various hats, and then 5 years in South Africa during the time of the first president, 4 years in the Netherlands, and then 4.5 years in Denmark, and 1 year at the Smithsonian. So even though the first airplane that I saw was at the age of 23, I've enjoyed. But my mother, who is no more, gave me one piece of advice. Now in the Western sense, she's illiterate, but she was fluent in 3 languages. She was a walking encyclopedia of knowledge of her communities. She said, you told me that in Australia, there's Indians about, at that time, 80,000, but there are people from 160 countries. Don't shack up with Indians, go and mix with others, learn as much as you can. So she gave me the advice that is very much against the idea of a reference group used by sociologists. So getting back to the beginnings, 1976 and 1977-78 were very important for me. I was a research student at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and had a wonderful professor, Romila Thapur, a very eminent historian, as my mentor. She got me to do 3 projects, and one was impact of monasteries on the daily life of Bhutanese in Bhutan. So I'm probably one of the few people who traveled the length and breadth of Bhutan, because I'm the same age as King Jigme Wangchuk, and I was the only one in Paro who could speak English at that time. So he sent me his retinue every day to speak English, and then gave me the garage, the driver and the car from the royal garage and the royal car to go anywhere in his kingdom, and I did go everywhere. And why was it important, that particular project? Because marriage, as we understand it, was not common in Bhutan at all those days. It was an influence of Bengalis from the Punsholing from the south of Bhutan. It was fashionable to get married in Bhutan. So in 1976, I attended a wedding of a grandfather with 26 grandchildren and innumerable great-grandchildren. It was their first wedding in the family. It was hilarious, it was fun. And so do you see the notion of marriage that we anthropologists always think kinship marriage, And so that project was really important for me. It was a seminar for my studies. The second one was very important. Remember, not all intangible heritage is good and worth safeguarding, right? I mean, female genital mutilation, is not, some people argue it's intangible heritage, but it's violates human rights, the very preamble of the convention. So there are others, like the caste system in India. So my next seminar paper was caste system in early Buddhism. So the whole Tripitaka in Pali, I analyzed it for my seminar paper. How pervasive is the caste system? How did Gautam Buddha deal with it? How the early Buddhists dealt with it? If you don't know my social background, but where I come from, you don't want to know the caste system and its discrimination and racism that's there. And I had to endure it, most of my early childhood and life. And so it's intangible heritage, the caste system, but it's not something that we want to cherish, we want to safeguard, we want to deal with, because it violates human rights, right? And the third one was, Professor Thapar sent me to Pune Deccan College, which is like one of the preeminent archaeological institutes in the world, and the best in India, to train as a field archaeologist. So I went to Bhimbedkar, which is on the World Heritage List now for its extensive rock art, for the first excavations. But my interest was not only to be in the trench, learning from the eminent professor Professor Mishra from Pune Deccan College, but to understand how come that Dorai Gons have lived in these rock art sites for so long. And what is their role apart from being volunteers, helping us wash tools and cook for us and all those things? So I used to go in the evenings to their village houses of the Daragons, right in the middle of the jungle. There were tigers, leopards, you name it, sloth bears, hyenas. And, but what I found was all the Daragons were scheduled tribes. That means they are designated constitutionally Aboriginal people of India. But they were all Muslim. So during work time, they were always taking 4 to 5 times a day off to go do the namaz. But when I went to their houses, what I found, the inside of the houses were all painted just like in the rock art sites. Now you know that is haram in Islam, to paint inside of your houses. This is the syncretic culture, the way, we have evolved. And you'll find the same thing everywhere in the world, how we were very syncretic, how modernity has actually constructed barriers and put us into straitjackets. So that was my introduction to what we now call intangible heritage. But we already had a term which is now being used in India. And it was called Jivana Varasatvam, that means living heritage. Varasatvam means heritage, Jivana is that which is living. We already called it in the mid-70s, Jivana Varasatvam. And so the story goes, fast forward a few years, those days, the only people who, what we Indians thought about Australia was the sheep farmers and wheat farmers who played good cricket and tennis. And nobody wanted to go to Australia, but I ended up going there thanks to, somebody, a very special family that encouraged me to go. And I never regretted. And my PhD thesis, which I did at JNU, part-time at Cambridge, and then, gave up, then went back to Australian National University, finished. I was really interested because I studied the largest early Buddhist collection, Buddhist sculptural collection in the world is in the British Museum. It all comes from one place called Amaravati in Andhra Pradesh, South India. And that's my birthplace, the entire collection. And so I started recataloguing that collection because the old catalog was from 1954. The grand old Douglas Barrett helped me a lot. He was so grumpy, nobody liked him, but he loved me. And he always took me in the evening at the end of the day, for a counter meal at the local pub near Russell Square. And I was a poor student, so I enjoyed the counter meal very much. And a counter meal that is also the intangible heritage of the British. It's dying out. And, but in doing that, what made me think, and what my PhD thesis was about is, like Art Institute of Chicago to Eva Women's University in Korea, they teach a special course called Amaravati School of Art based on these sculptures. But what was the society, what was the economy, what was the culture in which this sculptural tradition evolved? That was my interest. So what did I do? Archaeologically, there was intensification of agriculture from wooden plowshare to iron plowshare. So I actually rented an acre of land from a farmer, divided it into 2 plots. So I tilled one with some help with the wooden plowshare, and then one with the iron plowshare. Then I measured the labor days to understand what impact it would have had in intensification, because without intensification, there wouldn't have been the surplus for the trade, the extensive trade with the Greco-Roman world, and the donations for early Buddhist establishment, and for the founding, it's the founding place of Mahayana Buddhism. Before the Cultural Revolution in China, it was the world's largest faith, Mahayana Buddhism. This is where it took birth, and why there, why not somewhere else, not only the sculptural tradition. So I was trying to understand it by understanding some of the contemporary knowledge that was there on agrarian heritage of that place. So I still didn't know that it would be one day called, celebrated as intangible heritage, what I was doing. And then something happened quite dramatic in my life. At the age of 29, I was offered the position as the National Director of Affirmative Action for the employment, for the training of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders, museums, galleries, libraries, archives, national parks and World Heritage Sites and Heritage Councils for the whole of Australia by the Aboriginal Education Consultative Committee. But most importantly for me, in this context, it was entirely funded by the Council of the National Museum of Australia, because the future National Museum wanted to have, trained Aboriginal people to professionally work in museums. And this is, I'm going back to 1984-85. And this National Museum of Australia was already thinking about what most museums at those days didn't even think about, is the living heritage of Aboriginal people and their collections. But the challenge was that I was, as a member of ICOM, probably the oldest member of ICOM here in the audience, even the DG and others came afterwards, me, I know. And I reached out to International Committee for Training of Personnel, chaired by one Professor Patrick Boylan, for help. I don't know, there's no curricula, there's no pedagogy to train Indigenous people, how do I go about it? They basically said that, look, there is no comparative material, but if you're doing something, please let us know. But they gave me moral support. I had very eminent anthropologists, Annette Hamilton, Peter Sutton, Nick Peterson, Roger Keesing, actually coming in their own time to try and help me. But there was also opposition, very strong opposition from museums, at least two major museums. Since it's a fact, I can say it's being streamed, as the Queensland Museum and the Western Australian Museum put in writing that we want to employ Aboriginal people, but they go walkabout. They don't want to work, they're lazy, they don't want to work. They're a stereotype about Indigenous people. And but this is where ICOM, International Council of Museums, and UNESCO became very powerful allies for me, because Australia always wants to be recognized and appreciated by the international world. I mean, it's a kind of complex we've had for a very long time. And so when you got UNESCO and ICOM supporting a project, it's very powerful support. And so I want to acknowledge both UNESCO and ICOM, its role in the first ever affirmative action program in museums and heritage of any kind in the world, 1984-85. So, but how do you develop the curriculum and pedagogy? It was a challenge. People said, teach about traditional Aboriginal society, contemporary Aboriginal society, but I had a 19-member advisory committee who were all Indigenous, and who reminded me, in 1974, something changed in Australia. Until 1974, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, as it was then called, was established mainly to record, document the dying out cultures, because the Aboriginal culture was going to die out. So you have to document their languages, everything as much as possible. But in 1974, under the leadership of one very eminent archaeologist, Australia's first professor of archaeology, Professor John Mulvaney, that changed, that Aboriginal people are not going to die away. Their cultures are going to be here. And so within that context, how do I establish a program sponsored by the National Museum to train people? And what is even more wonderful is the Department of Industrial Relations reached an agreement that a museum would actually agree to employ an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, but they study with me for 8 months, but 3.5 months they work in the museum as scientific officer 1 or assistant curator, and 2 weeks at Christmas time holiday. But when they graduate, the museum legally is obliged to employ them. So that's how we first broke the ice. Even going to the extent that Queensland Museum, you could employ somebody without advertising the position as long as you gave the contract for 364 days. Plus one, it'll be 1 year, right? It's illegal. So that's how we got the first ever Aboriginal person to work in Queensland Museum in Brisbane. 364-day contract. But by the end of it, they didn't want her to leave. And she's a senior curator of the National Gallery of Australia now, Tina Baum. And so in this context, what we did was, we thought that it's not traditional Aboriginal society and adaptation. How Aboriginal society constantly and continuously evolved and continues to evolve. That's the framework we took. We had a subject course on Aboriginal material culture, where we also had collections, thanks to the National Museum of Australia, which generously gave me a lot of money to buy contemporary collections for teaching purposes. We even picked up, tools made more recently, with all kinds of, the hubcaps of cars which are made into little carrier things. We collected, and then people understood that Aboriginal material culture is not frozen in time, it's also continuously evolving. But the expressions that were used by the Unio from Arnhem Land was very much like, our culture is alive. But nobody put it more beautifully than the chair of the Kimberley Land Council in Northwestern Australia. He said, Waku Waku means son. Culture is a map written in the land. So you got to understand the land, because culture is written in it. So we created this amazing program which delivered the target number of people into the sector, right from national parks to the National Museum. And then they wanted it to continue. I said no, because in India I learned that affirmative action should If it works, don't continue, because then you diminish the self-esteem of people who've gone through it. So I said no. The Vice Chancellor came and sat in my room saying, look, there's so much money that comes to the university through your program. Those days, universities used to double dip. One, they got what is called Aboriginal Program Initiative money. The next thing, they counted the Aboriginal people as students once again, so they got twice the amount of money. They didn't want to lose the golden pot. I said no. I totally did. And my committee, my Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander committee, left the decision to me. The important thing is self-esteem is very important, the point I want to make. When you work with bearers and transmitters of intangible heritage who have not been recognized in the past, until recent past, suddenly you want to work with them in the museums. Well, first of all, why should they work? Because you didn't allow them in the past. Second thing is, who is empowering them? How do you recognize the first voice of people? When you deal with museums in this context, it's really important that in safeguarding intangible heritage, it's not only intergenerational equity, that's why so many young people, it's good news, but it's also dignity, self-esteem, which are clearly mentioned, if you look at the UNESCO documentation. And so then 1992, US was setting up the National Museum of the American Indian, so they sought my advice for their training program. Canada did through National Parks Canada, Brazil. Suddenly I started seeing the world, and then 1994 became a shock. I came back from Rio after dancing 11 nights up. Daytimes were hard work, every night a different nightclub and dancing. Totally buried and tired, sorry, my Australian expression, buried. And I come back, there's a fax from Winnie Mandela saying that they wanted me as opening keynote speaker at the Parktonian in Johannesburg for bringing Cinderella to the ball, the role of culture in post-apartheid South Africa. I was like not even 40, and I thought there must have been a mistake. So I sent a fax back saying that, Your Excellency, I think there are much better people than me, I think there's a mistake. Then a return fax came, the Association of Cultural Centers, of Black Cultural Centers of US, based in New York, Harlem, where I had a little stint with Studio Museum in Harlem and all these places, a supporting letter from them, and then UNESCO, signed by the then DG, but I knew it was Raj Yusuf, who was the Secretary of the World Commission for Culture and Development, who drafted it. 9-page fax back, why they decided I was the best person. So when I landed in South Africa, Winnie Mandela was still the Deputy Minister for Culture. One Gordon Metz, a dear young man, he's very special. He said to me, hey, come here, comrade, I want to tell you something. I said, well, what you did in Australia and elsewhere, it's preschool stuff. This is the real stuff, come and do the real stuff. And, but the point is, Rashid Arin, who founded Third Text and very famous author, Rashid Arin explained it to me. He said, in Australia, blacks were not in the parliament at that stage. It's all white people making decisions for Aboriginal people. And in the US, everywhere else, the minorities are not in the parliament, numerical minorities. They're not decision makers. But in South Africa, the majority are black, and the president is a black man. So you got to change things rather dramatically. So it took me 6 years to get an approach on return and repatriation of human remains in Australia. It took me 3 weeks in South Africa, because Mandela wanted it. Do you see power? So when you talk about museums and safeguarding intangible heritage, remember one of the critical factors is power relations. And I know that Richard Curran has been saying this continuously, who authorizes whose heritage? And so are we in museums authorizing intangible heritage? Are we validating them? And we still maintain self and the other paradigm, us and them. So it's a critical question that we have to constantly ask ourselves. And it's an ethical question. If you look at the Code of Ethics of the Intangible Heritage Convention, it is implied throughout, the significance of ethics, right? So, but in South Africa, what happened was I was the sole international technical advisor for the Arts and Culture Task Group that reviewed all the apartheid institutions, but also National Parks under a separate committee under late Dr. Yunus Mabuza. And, but what happened was, in the languages, what are here called Bantu languages, I was at Thiruvaran yesterday, Bantu languages, there's no word for heritage. But when we started talking about it, the Zulu, started saying, oh, you mean Amasiko? And the Shangaan started saying, you mean Maflele? And the vendor started saying, oh, Ditso. All these are closer to how the New Zealand Maori talk about their heritage. So heritage was thought about as something that's living, that we breathe through our ancestors. We breathe through our ancestors. And then the Shangaan chief said, you see, these objects and sites, they're just like the PowerPoint presentation we use. They're just illustrators, they're not real. I mean, it's a powerful message, as we were working on the new heritage legislation in South Africa. And so, move forward, closer to, 1999, 2000, the French National Commission organized a fishbowl think tank, fishbowl think tank, about 17 of us were put in the middle to discuss and debate. Everybody else was watching us, about 260 people. And so I was brought to that from Australia, and I was the youngest among them. The oldest was sitting right at the other end of the 17 people. And there was a very famous anthropologist whose name I shall not repeat, who talked about the Garifuna from Belize, as being primitive, uncivilized, and he kept on using all these terms. And so I just reacted. I said that maybe they think you are primitive and uncivilized, that you're not educated enough to understand their culture. So have you ever thought about it from the other way? Everybody was shocked. I won't mention his name. He's a very famous French anthropologist. And I came from Australia, where I was really empowered to do what was thought to be the best by the indigenous people. I mean, do I give an F, when he says things like this? But then during the morning coffee break, this Indian woman sitting at the other end, who's on the UNESCO executive board, she became my godmother after that. She's 94, 95 now. And she walked on in a very elegant sari, came up to me and she said, Amareswar, keep saying what you're saying. That's why you are here. We need to listen to your generation. I was the youngest there. And so this think tank was the beginnings of, do we need a convention? Are we happy with the recommendation, or do we need a convention? Why do we need it? This is how the whole discourse started, thanks to French National Commission for UNESCO. But the French were very keen on this. And then 1994 happened. 1994, remember, the Japanese could not get any of the World Heritage sites listed, which you have now, because from the Edo period, the Shinto shrines, everything, you can change the fabric as long as you use the same material, same technique, same knowledge. Now, this is not right with the World Heritage Convention, its ideas of integrity and authenticity. So we had the Nara Convention, or Nara Conference, Nara Recommendation, to the World Heritage Convention on authenticity. I was once again the youngest person to be brought there. Mr. Matsuro, who subsequently became the DG of UNESCO, was the chair of the National Commission for UNESCO Japan at that stage. And I was told by the Japanese I should feel free to say what I want to say. And I think myself and Christina Cameron are probably the only people still alive from that group. And Roland Silva, who chaired it, passed away, about last month. And that was the first time they had to acknowledge this very site-centered, fabric-centered heritage practitioners had to acknowledge that living heritage, intangible heritage is important in understanding the authenticity and integrity of a site or a place. It was a turning point in a way. And so that's 1994. Then we move forwards. We come to the fishbowl think tank I told you. And And then 2000, Sweden organized a Nordic ICOM conference in Stockholm. Mats Wittbom was the president of Swedish ICOM. Any Swedes here? There's Swedes here, right? And how come only one? You always overpopulate committees and conferences. And no, I'm just teasing you, so don't worry. And so when I went there, I was asked a very simple question. Nordic countries were thinking about their Asian collections. There was the move to rethink the national museums in Sweden, so they were really interested in this. I was the president of ICOM Asia Pacific. I just finished conducting a massive consultation across, 49 countries. And so they wanted me to, address it. So I said that, look, the thing is you have our collections, but you don't have our knowledge or intangible heritage. The intangible heritage is with us in Asia. Second thing is you have collections that the colonial people thought were important, but you don't have the collections that we think are important too. So we should work together. And so the second thing is I said it's really sad, thanks to colonialism, you have our collections in your museums in Europe, you can talk about Asia, but we don't have European collections in our museums to talk about Europe. The asymmetry of collections is what I focused on, and I focused on why it is important to understand the context through intangible heritage of the collections. And out of that came the establishment of ASIMUS, Asia-Europe Museums Network, which was launched in July 2001 in Barcelona. I was the president launching it, and I emphasized that this network should bring collections and communities together, and that the mediating discourse is intangible heritage. And then things happened. I was wearing different hats, mainly representing ICOM, with the meetings for the drafting of not just one convention, two. Some of you might not know that originally we were going to have one convention, then two conventions, 2003, 2005, and we wanted people to adopt them as the twin conventions, adopt both of them at the same time, because there's an old English saying, once a practice, twice a tradition. So where do you actually say this is intangible heritage and this is creativity? When creativity is actually drawing on intangible heritage, of the communities within that particular, space where they're creating. So how do you, that we shouldn't, even if there are two conventions, there are two conventions for very political reasons that I don't want to go into here. Most of which you know about it. And even without Trump, you understand, why we had to have a separate 2005 convention. And by the way, he's a good friend of India. He was there, treated, feted in India. And only last week, I left just in time. And so then at that stage, we were looking at this ICOM definition. I was the vice president of ICOM, so in 2007, we changed the definition of ICOM and included intangible heritage. I can tell you as the vice president, then vice president, it was a nightmare working with you Europeans. Nobody wanted, European communities were opposed to this intangible heritage. It's some, what somebody called it, he said, oh, this is Asian voodoo. That's how it was called, or primitive thought as somebody else called it. And, but we got it into the 2007 definition. And now, of course, it's being revised quite rightly because times have changed, challenges are different, but that 2007. But I was appointed as the chair of the ICOM Cross-Cultural Task Force. And one of the things that I did was in 2002, thanks to the Swedes, for some reason the Dutch and Swedes funded almost all my projects. They love me. And, and thanks to the Swedes, we brought 48 countries together in Shanghai to address globalization, intangible heritage, and museums. And just as we started the conference, the woman in charge, Noriko Aikawa, in charge of the Intangible Heritage Convention, She just walked in and said, Amma, we need to talk. I said, we're just starting with the, no, we need to talk. She came from Istanbul with the Istanbul Declaration. She wanted us to endorse it. But when I put it to the people, they said, how can we endorse something we're not part of? So it became a very challenging forum, Shanghai. And there is a Shanghai Declaration on Globalization, Museums and Intangible Heritage. But that led to something else. The Koreans were there in Shanghai, ICOM Korea. So they wanted to, they already were given the right to host the 2004 ICOM Triennial General Conference. But they didn't do anything 2004 till 2003, nothing. So Jacques Perrot was the president of ICOM, late Manus Brinkman, the Secretary General. So they sent me on a special mission to Korea to take away, because ICOM has the emergency provision. If somebody can't deliver the General Assembly, they can hold it in Paris, and to take it away unless they're prepared to do something about it. The first meeting with ICOM Korea was, no, Professor, we organize the World Cup soccer. This is nothing we can do in 2-3 months. I said, that's great, you can do it in 2-3 months. What we'll do in ICOM is we'll work out who are the participants. You fund all of them, their travel, everything. But they said, how many? Maybe 3,000 people? I said, no, we can't do that. I think you better organize so people can plan and budget. So, and then the theme became Museums and Intangible Heritage for 2004. I finished my final report on ICOM Cross-Cultural Task Force, submitted it, and it's called the ICOM Cultural Diversity Charter. And, but one of my recommendations was that the discourse on intangible heritage, from a not conforming to the convention, and but actually more intellectual engagement is very limited, and that we should do something about it. So Hung Nam Kim was the director of the National Folk Museum. She and I agreed to co-found a journal called the International Journal for Intangible Heritage. And just to get that discourse going, like for museums and intangible heritage. And I was the second and third editor-in-chief. And so as we come forward, not very far, but as we come forward, something dramatic happened in Netherlands. I was doing a master class for 18 PhD students from 16 countries between what was called the Volkskunde, National Museum of Ethnology, Wereld Museum in Rotterdam, and the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, with the 3 directors supporting me. So we were all in the Tropen Museum, and one morning in November 2004, and I mean, museums can be very stuffy places, right? So I like to get out for a little bit of fresh air. And so I got out and I saw what looked like a body covered in white cloth. The police were on the other side. I came out on the side through the Kinder Museum of the Tropen. When I saw that, my God, it looks like somebody's been covered up, dead. The police ran to my side, so I didn't advance towards the body, which I was actually. And it was Theo van Gogh. He was murdered. And the Dutch society fell apart. Until then, Dutch society was one of the most benevolent multicultural funding agencies in Europe. So much money for projects dealing with multiculturalism. Overnight, 16 Muslim mosques and so on were attacked, torched, sprayed. One primary school with primary school children was burned down. Thank God no children died, no teachers died. And 3 Lutheran mosques were attacked by Muslims in retaliation. The Dutch society fell apart. And it was just like, then they wanted to know how to go about this. And I saw a presenter before with his performance. He's got Stan against his name. Stan was involved in organizing a conference at the Tropen Museum called Dancing with Diversity. You can get CDs, you can download it. Very careful, Dancing with Diversity. Baroness Lola Young, who was in the upper house of the British Parliament, a woman who as black as you can get, thick red lipstick, leather boots, every second word is F this and F that, And she and I were invited as opening speakers. There were ministers of culture from Germany, from Norway, from everywhere, huge people, how to deal with this crisis in the Netherlands, which is a crisis in Europe. And so that's how I established the inclusive museum movement. Because I felt for too long museums, irrespective of what they say, was always about us and them. We, the curators, we, the conservators, we, the museum people, will allow you to self-determine what you say in our institutions. That kind of power relationship was very strong. But I drew upon the work in South Africa because what Mandela did when he was committed for treason, if you look at this, online images, he says, South Africa is for all South Africans. He never said just for blacks. South Africa is for all South Africans. On the 10th of May, 1994, he was elected as president on 27th of April. But 10th of May, when he was inaugurated in the Union Square in Pretoria, he finished up by his speech, inaugural speech, by thundering across the Union Square in Pretoria by saying, let there be land, let there be water, and let there be salt for all people of South Africa. So when we were working on policies, he was very clear that anything that we do is for all South Africans. It's not just about black, colored, Khoi Khoi or Nama, San. It's for all South Africans. So that's what transformed the South African national parks into what it is today. The only park system in the world that is self-reliant. Every other park system gets subsidies from government. There's the only one. The way we did the transformation. So I drew upon this and then, the inclusive museum movement. I'm often asked to define what is an inclusive museum. And I'm watching. I got my watch. I know exactly how much. Yep. I actually got 12 minutes. You said 10. And so that inclusion is all of us. So how do we transform museums with all of us rather than having token blacks and token women and token ethnics, which was fairly common in those days. How do we transform? And but in doing this, we were bringing in diaspora communities. This is where the 4 years that I advised at the Leiden Volkskunde Museum is that they were very much looking at the Dutch were there, so the collections are here. So they did a ribbon around the world in the old museum and the Dutch collections, because the Dutch were there, the collections are here. I said, hello, the Dutch were there, the collections are here. But how about the Dutch were there, so the people are here? So we put the people into the picture. That was what I did, my role there in the museum. And the first project, which some of you would know, because I had to do some demonstration projects, and the Dutch cabinet had a budget called Galla Projecten. My surname is Galla. Galla Projecten, blocks of 10,000 euros, which is worth like 100,000 euros now, and for curators to do things. So the first project I did was mapping the Leiden district and understanding the people. What is it that's most important for them? It's on the representative list of the intangible heritage of UNESCO, Nauruz. So what we did was we brought all the people from Turkish people to Bangladesh people into the museum to look at the collections from their countries. Then we opened up the museum for Nauruz for the long weekend for them to take over the museum. First, they couldn't believe that these collections were there. Second, they couldn't believe Nauruz would be honored by a museum. Remember, it was a very old colonial museum which transformed dramatically. And I want to give you that example because these demonstration projects based on evidence-based, research-based are really important. One of the things, given that now I've got exactly 10 minutes now, my watch says, and I want to be a little bit more critical, but first of all, I want to thank you for these 5 conferences you had, amazing platform that you built, so making my job easy to say coming last, and but I hope it's not the last for you. This is the beginning of the next phase. There's a lot to do. What the Canadians did when they wanted to deal with intangible heritage and cultural diversity, when Sheila Finstone was the Minister for Multicultural Affairs years ago, is they established a fund for demonstration projects dealing with cultural diversity and living heritage, both. Even though Canada is not a state party to the convention, it doesn't matter. People still do, like in Australia, you know. We were leading in many ways in the world. And by the way, I'm Australian, but live in India, and life goes on. So I just want to give you some feedback that please don't try to define and contain those spaces where you deal with, you know, in your museums, with collections and communities. Please don't define them. Defining is containing. And I think if you want to be more European based, read the theories of atmosphere in Europe that are coming out, fantastic theories of atmosphere. That in fact the people who come into the museum as visitors, as collaborators, whatever, together with the collections, they create the atmosphere in the museum. It's a holistic, total approach. So they have wonderful theories in Europe. And thanks to your Russian and Hungarian migrants, by the way. And so it's, that's my first thing. And I know that people are struggling to address this, they, you know, calling contact zones, this and that, binary oppositions, you know, self and other exhibition at the British Museum, you name it. We have had so many experiments that we made. But try to don't define it and contain it. Defining is containing. And my next thing is that I want to tell you is what I'm doing right now in India. The British Museum has this fantastic collection that I mentioned to you, right? Buddhist collection. But where it comes from, they don't even know that it exists. Neil McGregor was the director when I was with him. I said to him, Neil, but you know, Amaravati actually is a place where I was born. He said, what do you mean Amaravati is a place you're born? Isn't it a mythological place? No, it's real. The stupa is still there. You took all the sculptures, but the stupa is still there. The mound is still there. The timber is still there. So what I've done is, what is coloniality? The process of colonization. I gave a keynote speech in Vienna in early December. I had to tell, they were asking me to speak on decolonization. My question was, have you understood colonization in museums? How could you decolonize if you don't understand the colonization process? You have to understand. I mean, if you go to a doctor and say, look, I'm feeling sick, if the doctor doesn't do tests and diagnosis and prescribe, and just says, no, you're dying of this, would you accept it? So you have to understand what is colonialism. So coloniality and contextuality. Remember when you're trying to bring together collections and communities, the communities were not frozen in time. They have been changing since you removed the collections. So don't be patronizing. And I know, I have instances that I won't mention here. Don't be patronizing to people. Oh, you're from, you know, Amaravati. You should know about this. What? After 300 years of colonialism, you still want me to know what it was like? And but it's a very delicate space. You have to negotiate it. It's an unknown space, and that's why I call it liminal space. There are many rites of passage. All our discourses about museums and community engagement have not come very far because the power relationship is still with us, the authorizing agency of the museum. So in the new definition of the museum, although it's more a manifesto rather than a definition, it has the substance for a new definition. Is that we really need to think about this kind of situationality of the museum within the contextual spaces. I know we've used wonderful expressions like source communities, this and that, but those are all European museums trying to find their own relationship. Just like Guillermo Gomez Pino, the borderline artist from US, once said famously, postmodernism is a mess that you modernists have made. It's got nothing to do with us. So try to understand the context. Then the other thing is Ajahn Padrai. I mean, those of you who do material culture, I'm sure you know who Ajahn Padrai is. I mean, he's brilliant work, very famous anthropologist from the Chicago School. He's from South India. And in that, he actually says, we talk about globalization, but we only engage with the 20% at the top internationally. We do not engage with the 80% below, and certainly not the 20% at the bottom, where our cultural context are actually located. So you really have to think about, not just talk about globalization like a parrot, like a mantra, but actually what exactly do you mean? What is grassroots globalization, as Arjuna Padre talks about? And but the other thing is, has museology actually evolved? Has museology, I'm not just talking about ICOM, otherwise I'm denying everything I've said about my role with ICOM, but has museology as a study of science of museum, has it really evolved to understand, to engage with the 2003 convention with intangible heritage? And we just had a research meeting at the Smithsonian. They brought eight of us from around the world, gave us 3 days to discourse. We did. And we agreed. We didn't think that museums were ready to address intangible heritage. So I think that you have to really rethink your curricular planning, your pedagogy, not just add it as an end. If you do that, it'll be like the fat tail of a sheep that we see in Australia. It's not actually the sheep. And don't use it as an appendage. Try to rethink, what does your curriculum mean in museology? What is your pedagogy? How do you actually teach intangible heritage? How do you teach? How do you engage? In Australia, when I was doing what I was doing, I paid the elders who were coming. I paid them the same as I would pay a university professor with knowledge coming in. So they were paid for coming and sharing in the classroom with the students. And so you have to think about that. And the other thing is that we are all dealing with budgets, we're all dealing with political situations, and there's more and more what I see is chameleon-like, chameleons? And chameleon-like changes. Today this government is this, so we're going to do this because we get the support for the money. And my question, which my Danish friends supported me very strongly but got offended at the same time. Any Danes here? No. I've given up my cards, I'm no longer a Dane. And which countries made most money based on slavery? Britain, France, Netherlands, which is the country which was extremely poor, but became the fourth in this richest country, Denmark. If you look at all their buildings, right from the palace to Institute for Culture, all the buildings, they were all built from money from slave trade. The Danes still, the Mast, for instance, is the world's largest shipping company. What the Danes could do is not like the British, bring them to Liverpool and then take them across the Americas, or the Dutch to Rotterdam, take them to the Americas, or the French to Calais, take them to the Americas. They didn't do that. They were good at shipping, so they did transoceanic shipping, direct, without they having to come to. Only the wealth came. And so the reason I'm mentioning that is that can we transform to address some of these issues in a realistic way? And I come back to Netherlands, a country that I love extremely, because they're very honest. They're quite good at, the British are good at laughing at themselves, but the Dutch are good at looking at themselves and changing. The British still, Brexit or no exit, whatever, they're still the same. They think the empire still, the sun never sets on the empires, whatever. And I come back to Netherlands, because one of the projects that I had was to work with the Swahili-speaking descendants in the Netherlands. So you have the theater in Leiden, so the Swahili king was coming, oh, great news. Then all these blacks in Netherlands, they're all going to come and welcome him. So the curator decided this is what's going to happen. Not one black Dutch person showed up to see the Swahili king. And she was furious. She stormed into my office saying that, what the F is wrong with them? I worked so hard to create this, blah, blah, blah. I said, but did you ever talk to the black Dutch? The descendants of the Swahili? She said, why? The Swahili king is coming. They should be grateful that I'm organizing this. I said, no. You know what they have told me, and I tried to tell you, but you never listen. And is that, why should they come to see the king whose ancestors sold their ancestors? Do you see, once you do your evidence-based research, they still have in their conscience, it isn't just the Dutch taking them, but their own king sold them. It takes two hands to clap. You can't understand that. So I think that, you know, and then the whole question of marketplace. In the marketplace, it's very sexy to present something exotic. So I've seen museums present intangible heritage performances which look really nice. So the noble savage and the anthropological cabinets that we brought out by rethinking museology, suddenly you're applying the same paradigm for people presenting their intangible heritage elements. It's racist within your own countries. It's got nothing to do with color. It's patronizing. A lot of museums do this. They think it's, oh, we're having a conference. Can you come and, you know, perform your blah, blah, blah? It's so patronizing. Please don't do it. That denigrates people. You're actually using them. You're not changing, but you're actually using them. And you use the word stakeholders all the time. You know, what the hell do you mean by stakeholders? Your first idea of stakeholders is your curators, your directors, your funders, your trustees, and then you think, okay, this guy from this community, this community works well with our museum, so we'll identify. So you go and identify the people that you want to work with because you think they are as middle class as you, it's easy to work with them. So you really have to rethink the notion of stakeholders. You have to think about what is first voice. Whose voice? First voice. You have to think of language. It was emphasized this morning. And in fact, the website for the World Language Day emphasizes, our website for the ICH Convention, 2-3 Convention, if you go to it now, emphasizes on World Language Day that the language in which, you know, the element is carried and transmitted is extremely important. It's critical. And Janet emphasized that this morning, right in the beginning. And lastly, your 5 encounters, you know, that you had before here opened up more questions than answers for me. There are more questions, and I won't go into them now. But that's really good. That means you're actually seriously engaging with these things. And so some of you, for me, I'm an Australian, you can send me back to there, or India will accept me, whatever I say. But I'll be honest. For me, the benchmark for you to actually engage with intangible heritage is to deal with some of the most difficult aspects of it. Where are the Roma in your discourse? They were victimized by the Nazis. They're marginalized now by your governments. Where are the Roma? What about the intangible heritage of the Roma? It's really important because for me that'll be the benchmark. The day you're able to handle that. We were going to do it in the National Museum of Ethnology, Leiden. We negotiated with the Roma. We had 7 wagons, exhibits inside the wagons. People could go through them. Everything was conceptualized. And then Theo van Gogh was murdered. What the Roma always did is when they struggled, they crossed the borders. They all went across into Germany. They were not there in Netherlands. So, so the kind of pathways and the way, you know, to use Robert Frost's, you know, untrodden pathways that you're prepared to take is going to determine, you know, how you move forward. But the one thing is that at least you're very conscious that intangible heritage does not have borders. You know, it does not have borders. It is living, you emphasized it, but how it is conceptualized as living should be done by the carriers, the bearers and transmitters, not by outside people saying, oh, this is what is living and what your heritage, this is not. So I just wanted to make it very auto-ethnographic, but I want to finish up by saying one thing, why it is important to work across the conventions. And this is my final thing. One of the things we don't do well in UNESCO is work across conventions. We don't. Every convention becomes a silo area. So when Francisco Bandaran was the ADG, he had once a month a forum to cut across convention borders. They tried to restructure. And then when Irina Bukava, Francisco Bandaran, and Kishore Rao asked me to produce the 40th anniversary flagship project for UNESCO, for 40th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention, my condition was 2 things. I had 2 conditions. One is I want to freely engage indigenous people, because very often they're missing in a lot of the areas. So half the authors, there are 26 authors who speak, 26 chapters from around the world, 32 authors, and among us we spoke 129 languages. And half of the people here are indigenous people. And so that was one. The second thing I said was, look, I've been working in Korea and I find it really confusing. Why, if there's intangible heritage element in a World Heritage Site, why don't we talk about it when we talk about outstanding universal value? We know what the differences are between the two conventions, but what about the intangible heritage that's in the World Heritage Sites? So here you find almost every chapter deals with right from Kaya Forest to Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in Australia. Every chapter brings in, apart from 5 specialized chapters, brings in intangible heritage, an integral part of World Heritage discourse. And I think we've got to learn to do that, because otherwise we're reinventing the wheel, we're wasting a lot of resources and so on, but most importantly, we're missing out on safeguarding valuable heritage of all in all its manifestations. Thank you for listening to me.